The Insight. The Insightome.
Podcast.
Genetics.
Human.
Archaeology.
Denisovans.
Neanderthals.
Metabolism.
Ancestry.
Where in the world did we come from?
I am
Unique DNA.
Genome. From Austin,
Texas.
Last week, on part 1 of Neander-Me, we looked at what it means to be a little bit Neanderthal.
How we interpret the data is obviously conditioned by how we view this population, because there's all this evidence now that they were much more culturally complex.
When we look at the record as it's emerging now, I think you see less of some behaviors in the past because they were evolving.
This week, Neander-Me, part 2. So, 2010, the first analysis of the Neanderthal genome was published.
Yeah.
And that was pretty earth-shaking. I mean, people, Savante and a couple of other people who were kind of trying to do this sequence, ancient material from Neanderthals, had kind of hinted at things at conferences, and you mentioned you saw this talk.
Yeah.
So, people were wondering what was going to happen. And then the genome was published. Mm-hmm. So what was your initial reaction to that, reading that paper? Because you were like fully ensconced in the field at that point.
Yeah.
That was a big paper.
That was big. It was, so I suspected something was up because I went to the 2008 talk, and then 6 months or a year later, Svante gave another talk, and it was on YouTube, and he said something that was weirdly non-committal. And this was, in hindsight, this was when they were like finding anomalous results. And so that's why he said so. In a Q&A, he said something non-committal. And I remember thinking, like, okay, something is up, because he was very, very certain in 2008, right? And I already heard rumors from actually people like 2 to 3 months before that this result was going to happen, because there were a fair number of authors, and they were passing the manuscript around. So word had gotten out. So I was not shocked, frankly, at the generality of the result. The details were very fascinating. There's a lot of details, because when you have a whole genome, there's a lot of functional information that you could interpret. In terms of the broader community, there were a lot of people who were shocked, because, especially if you were outside of evolutionary genomics, you did not know, you did not suspect. There were a lot of paleoanthropologists that were shocked that I know of and have talked to. And then there were other people like Milford Wolfoff, multi-regionalist, who believed in a lot of admixture already. For them,
it was like, see, we told you.
Yeah, well, he told me in private email, frankly, and I've said this in public, so it's not like, breaking a confidence. It was like a weight lifted off his shoulders, because, it's too strong to say he was a laughingstock, but
he had gotten a lot of flack. Yeah,
people
definitely
just humored him, because what does he think that like we would have, sex with Neanderthals? That that's gross. There would be these sorts of things that you would, these sorts of assertions people would make, because it was genetics had disproven admixture. Even though population geneticists themselves were always very skeptical that it had disproven anything. So if readers are curious, or listeners are curious, there's a 1998 paper by Magnus Nordborg, which like outlines the population genetic theory. We'll put it on the website. Yeah, it'll be on the website. So in any case, the results came out. There are people like Richard Klein at Stanford. I heard him on the radio right afterwards, and he's a physical anthropologist who's written about huge differences between modern humans and archaic humans. And in the 2000s, he was very popular and pretty big. He was just kind of straight up denial, because this is a big thing to take. There were people who had hypothesized that Neanderthals couldn't even speak, and basically they weren't human, and that they were no different than, say, other great apes. Right? So it's a big psychological hurdle for a lot of people. Yeah.
Definitely. And one of the interesting things that came out of the paper, so, that analysis that we were just talking about, where you do this comparison with Africans and Europeans and Asians, and the Europeans and Asians turn out to be shifted slightly toward the Neanderthals, and the percentage that was calculated at that point, I think, was much higher than what it eventually turned out to be. It's like 4% or something. It's really around 1.2 to 1.4%. Yeah. Anyway, so one of the interesting things for me, and what was really unexpected, is, okay, it's pretty clear that there were no major barriers to interbreeding, but the interbreeding only seems to have gone one way, because they didn't find modern human DNA in the Neanderthal genome.
At that time, they did not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the issues that we do have is, it's like if you watch science fiction like Star Trek, there are some aliens that have racial differences among the aliens, while humans obviously have, it's like viewed from our perspective, they all look the same. And Neanderthals almost certainly had population structure and population history too. And so, last year there was a paper out of Adam Siepel's group, which did show the Altai Neanderthals, which is a different population than some of the others that are sampled out of Europe, but related. Altai Neanderthals did have some relationship. There was some admixture from modern human populations at a low level, but it existed. So there is more complexity since that came out, right? Now, in terms of why the Neanderthals did not have modern human, African human admixture, well, I mean, my own hypothesis or my own model is when you had low population densities, gene flow did not happen nearly as much as occurs today. When you have high population densities and humans are interconnected and there's long distance trade, and I'm not diminishing the fact that humans traded with each other. If you read some of Matt Ridley's work, he talks about how even hunter-gatherers, you see the way they traded stone. But I think that genetic barriers, because of geography, were much higher. And there is some evidence that there are genetic incompatibilities between Neanderthals and modern humans. It doesn't mean that they're not fertile, but they might have had like lower fitness in terms of the offspring. So there's some issues there already. But in general, I just think that there was a lot of population structure in the before history, and this is true for modern humans too. So I think when it comes to different hominin populations, it was even more true.
So what was the range of Neanderthals? Because, I mean, we think about them being like, obviously Germany, where the type specimen was found, France, Spain, but they're found all the way over in the Altai Mountains, and that's in
Mongolia.
Siberia, nearly in Mongolia, Western Mongolia.
So they're basically a northern Eurasian species that spans Siberia to Western Europe. Now, people are going to focus on Western Europe because that's where the archaeologists are, that's where the sites are, that's where, just a lot of the focus is going to be. But this was a pan-Eurasian species, at least in across the Palearctic, biogeographic zone. So, yeah, I mean, if you had a human population that ranged that far, you wouldn't want to generalize about them. But we do that about Neanderthals because we kind of have, made them the other.
And then something else happened. There was another find that Svante published a few years later.
Yeah.
The Denisovans, as they are called. So named after a cave. The Denisova cave, which is it's actually in the Altai, in Siberia.
Yeah, it's like a very small area where there are modern human remains, Denisovan remains, and Neanderthal remains.
So what they found, they were looking at this pinky bone and a tooth, I believe, that didn't quite look completely Neanderthal. They weren't sure what it was. They were originally found in 2008, and so they decided to sequence the genome. The DNA was very well preserved, which kind of makes sense because they were in a cryogenic deep freeze. In this Siberian cave and very protected from the elements and cold temperature and so on. So very high quality sequence. And lo and behold, when they compared that sequence to modern humans and to Neanderthals, it didn't look like either one.
No.
So it was another species.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's kind of crazy because we never suspected that species existed. We only knew about it from the DNA.
Yep.
So who were the Denisovans?
Yeah. And so to back up really quickly, what we know now is the Denisovans seem to be closer to Neanderthals than to modern humans. So the Denisovans and Neanderthals diverged hundreds of thousands of years ago, but after their common ancestors, Heidelbergensis, probably diverged from the African populations that gave rise to most of our ancestry, right? So, they are a sister species to Neanderthals, and we are a cousin species to both of them. That's one way to think of it. In all probability, Neanderthals seem to have stopped around the Altai in Mongolia. So Denisovans are almost certainly an East Eurasian lineage.
So they're kind of the Asian Neanderthal. That's the way I think about them.
Yeah, they're the Asian descendants of some sort of expansion outside of out of Africa, way further back than ours.
So they're Asian Neanderthals. I think they diverged from the Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago.
That's what I remember.
But when they compared the Denisovan sequence to modern humans, they found a really weird pattern.
Yeah. So the pattern was there was admixture into one lineage of modern humans.
Okay, so modern humans contain a little bit of Denisovan DNA.
Yes, and
But the location
is
of the
weird.
people who contain the most Denisovan DNA was really unexpected because it's not in Siberia,
No.
where the cave is found.
No.
It's not in Central Asia, a little bit south of there. It's not even in China. It's across Wallace's line, way over in Melanesia. So it's like Papua New Guineans, people living far away, across an ocean even.
Yeah.
And so
Now,
what's the story?
yeah,
there?
we still don't know the total story. We still don't know the total story of what's going on here, partly because we don't have that many. We have the Denisovan samples. There are more than one now, but they're from these Siberian, Mongolian populations, right? I think the most plausible hypothesis is that this was an expansive population that ranged much further south, and as humans came out of Africa and went through South and Southeast Asia, they mixed with them. It doesn't look like there are high levels of Denisovan ancestry on mainland Asia, but the latest
there is
research,
some, and
yes,
it's detectable.
the
It's
latest
less than 1%, but
yeah,
it's
well
there.
less than 1%. Well less than 1%, like closer to like 0.1%. That order of magnitude. But now they are detecting Denisovan admixture in places like China, Southeast Asia, and India. So that suggests that Neanderthals and Denisovans separated Eurasia between them.
And so, as people moved in, they largely displaced the Denisovans.
Yes.
And they got shunted down into Southeast Asia and then across Indonesia, presumably, all the way over to places like Papua New Guinea, and they're stuck there. That's like a cul-de-sac. And maybe the people that made it to New Guinea first, there were lots of Denisovans running around that had been kicked out of other places. And, so that's why we see a stronger signal. But it's a really crazy finding.
Yeah. And it's,
when I first read that, I was like, no, that can't be real.
Yeah, and so I had heard rumors about this as well at about the same time because I think they were seeing it, but at the same time, but they needed to confirm it. Like I said, because Neanderthals we know a lot about. Denisovans were mysterious. Initially, when they found the mtDNA, that was actually like way more different than Neanderthals or modern humans, and they called it X-woman. But then the whole genome.
I kind of like that.
Yeah.
X-woman.
Yeah. Well, today, it has more pop culture resonance than it did then. But in any case, the Denisovan story is still to be told, which is one reason, it's more difficult to do a Denisovan app because, it's not as rich in terms of what we can tell about it because Neanderthals have been part of our history. Like, they're literally part of our history. Our genetic history, but they've been part of
But
human
we do
history.
have some. So in the Incytome Neanderthal app, where we talk about these traits that you've inherited, we have some Denisovan examples, and they're some of the most interesting ones, I think.
Yeah.
So the Tibetan high altitude adaptation.
Yes.
This is a
Why don't you speak of
really
that?
really amazing story. So this was Rasmus Nielsen's group at Berkeley. They're looking at the Tibetan population and asking a question that, I think anybody would ask if they've been there. I have been lucky enough to visit myself. This is a place that's above 4,500 meters, so it's like 15,000 feet up in the air and not a lot of oxygen. And so you have to adapt to the lower oxygen levels there. And the way most people adapt, if you live there for a while, you'll produce more red blood cells. Turns out that isn't the case for the Tibetans. Their red blood cell level is somewhat higher, but it's not as high as like the average lowlander. Their blood cell level would be if they lived there for, say, 6 months. And so there's some genetic difference there. And so Rasmus Nielsen's group was looking at why is this? How have people adapted to that? Because if you think about having tons of red blood cells, that can cause lots of circulatory issues, stroke, and so on. So it's not a good thing long term. Well, it turns out that the Tibetans have adapted through this really interesting pathway, and we won't go into the biochemical details, but there's a key gene called EPAS1, where they differ significantly from the surrounding lowland population, the Han Chinese that live just a few hundred miles away. And this region of the gene that confers this adaptation to high altitude in the Tibetans is found at very high frequency. It's over 90% in the Tibetan population. But that segment of the gene is very different from anything you see anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
In fact, it's so different, it doesn't even look human.
Yeah.
So they started to compare this to some of these other archaic genomes, Neanderthal, Denisovan, as they were coming out, and they found a match for the Denisovan.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that as people were migrating from the lowlands up into the Tibetan highlands, they encountered some big, burly Denisovan dudes who presumably were living there with this adaptation ready, raring to go. And they intermixed with them,
Yeah.
and they took that segment of DNA
Yeah.
as kind of a shortcut to adapt to high altitude.
Mm-hmm.
So there were Denisovans living in Asia.
Yeah.
We encountered them. We mixed with them. We took a little chunk of their genome. It gave us this amazing adaptation. I've kind of speculated that maybe something like a Neanderthal or a Denisovan living in the Pamirs of the Himalayas 5,000, 10,000 years ago, maybe a relictual population of those creatures or individuals could have been the source of the Yeti myths,
Yep.
The abominable snowman.
Yep.
And it kind of makes sense, in a way. It's like, humans populate the lowlands and, we encounter these creatures that were forced up into the highlands when we finally start moving in there. But it's a really cool story.
Yeah.
So we do see specific traits that did come in from the
Yep.
Denisovans.
So, I mean, at this point, we've been talking about the history and the ancestry and the genealogy. But, now that we're getting down to the traits, that shows you another aspect where it's not just the past, it's also the present and the future. So, yes, we may carry within us a couple of % of the genome being from Neanderthals, or even less in the case of Tibetans for Denisovans. But
it's actually doing something.
yeah, when it comes to
Functional.
one specific trait, that might be a different thing altogether. So, these ancient populations of humans that lived outside of Africa, they lived there for a long time. So they had a lot of local adaptations. Now, when you have a population that adapts, it needs to take the variation. This is like, evolution and genetics 101. It needs to take the variation that the population has within it and adapt and figure something out. And often they're kludges, they're imperfect. Well, if you have another population which has lived there for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, and, aside from altitude adaptation, think about local diseases, right? Well, why reinvent the wheel? You mix a little with them, and then you get all of these new, quote, mutations. They're not really mutations because they've been in these local populations. They're tried and tested. And so you don't have to, create your own thing. You can just adapt from the people that have already lived there, and that speeds up evolution. Right?
Yeah, and this is a really cool part of the story to me is, and this is the impetus behind, doing the app in the first place is, it's cool to hear that you're 1-2% Neanderthal, but it's really cool to hear about what you got from them, especially if it's doing something, interesting for you, high altitude adaptation and then, fatty acid metabolism and so on.
Yeah, all of these different there are functional things which Neanderthals probably gave to people in Eurasia, particularly northern Eurasia. Some of it makes sense, like circadian rhythm, some of these things where it's going to be very different from the tropics, and it will take a long time to adapt, and the Neanderthals have already figured out a solution. So if you mix a little bit with Neanderthals, you get a couple of those genes, and it turns out that they confer way more fitness. The genes are going to spread just through positive selection, just standard population genetic theory, right? So if you have all of these local ecotypes, these local human populations in given regions, as modern humans spread, they could pick up a lot of benefits from these local populations without having to develop their own adaptations, right? So it's adaptations for free. You've already had an experiment that's been done for you.
Yeah, definitely. So the last thing I want to talk about is the percentage Neanderthal DNA that we carry around, is that decreasing over time? It seems to be. If we look at, we mentioned,
DNA.
The ancient DNA that was within a few generations, the percentage was much higher. Seems to be that, it's dropping off over time. We're, 1.2 to 1.5% now. Is it going to go to zero? What are we going to hold on to?
It's not going to go to zero. There's two issues here. There are the drop-off in percentage because of refinements to the inference, refinements to the methods and the genomes that we have. That is somewhat of
But that's a technical
That's an
issue.
artifact. Right?
I'm talking about a real drop
But the real
in the percentage.
drop-off, you can see it in ancient DNA, and you can also see it when you look in the genome, segments that look Neanderthal are less common around regions of the genome that code for proteins. Right? So functional regions. The implication here is since Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans were separated for over 500,000 years, their genomes started adapting in different ways in terms of their interactions, that when you brought them back together, it wasn't a perfect fit. And so over the generations, the fraction of Neanderthal genomes in our genomes has been decreasing because there has been negative selection. So earlier we were talking about EPAS1 with Denisovans. That's positive selection. There's things with Neanderthals that suggest positive selection as well. But maybe the bigger story would be negative selection, because when you bring two populations together that have been separated for a while, there's some incompatibilities, right? And the population that has the bigger numbers are going to win out. Like, that is the genetic background that the Neanderthals are operating in, and they're somewhat at a disadvantage. And so over time, it's decreased. I don't think it's not going to go down to zero, but it will, continue to decrease as selection is operating. But I mean, at some point, most of the Neanderthal ancestry then will be localized in non-genic regions, non-functionally relevant regions, and they're like, it's not at a disadvantage.
Except for these cases where it provides an adaptation.
Yeah. In the case where it provides an adaptation, it's going to be the opposite. So in strongly functional regions of the genome, you're going to see two trends. Most of the time, the Neanderthal ancestry is not going to be there, or will be less than expectation because of negative selection. But in a small minority of cases, it's going to be way, way more common than you would expect based from like 1 or 2% of the genome, and like EPAS1 for Denisovans in Tibetans is a classical case. There are some others having to do with immune response. I believe one of the haplotypes, that dystrophin, which is on the X chromosome about muscle development, is at a higher frequency than you would expect. It's like 10 to 20%. And actually, I carry that dystrophin copy. So the Neanderthal, but that's just just a little anecdata there. But yeah, so there's going to be more to the story to tell. We're still discovering new things, and we're getting more Neanderthal genomes. I think there's going to be a limit in how many archaic populations we're going to be running into, because the world is of a finite size. But we could have some more surprises. We have some Denisovans from Mongolia. I think the next stage is going to be the tropics. The technologies are getting better, so we were talking about like
the hobbits.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Could those be the Denisovans?
I mean, who knows? I mean, they look a little different, but adaptation can change body form really much faster than So the issue here with the technology, though, is some of the stuff we've been talking about, it's gotten better even since 2010. Like looking at the inner ear bone, they've been able to retrieve stuff. They have a genome from Ethiopia from 4,000 years ago. There is a great deal of circumstantial evidence that the same dynamic that we are talking about outside of Africa occurred within Africa. And that is going to be, if there's a next chapter, I believe that is the next chapter, because there were probably many different types of hominins within Africa 1 to 200,000 years ago, and we are the last one standing. But just as in outside of Africa, there was mixture with these other lineages.
For perspective, we reached out to anthropologist John Hawks.
I think the big mystery is what's going on in Africa.
Okay.
Honestly.
And what is going on? What's the mystery? Tell us.
Here's the thing. Once you were able to find Neanderthal ancient DNA, and you saw this signature that you've got a small percentage of Neanderthal ancient DNA in some living people, that like shows you, oh, this is what it looks like when you have ancient DNA in living people, right?
Yeah.
And teams began to look at African genetic samples. Mike Hammer's group, University of Arizona, Sarah Tishkoff's group, University of Pennsylvania. They're looking for African samples, these signs that something is there hidden in them.
Yeah.
And they found them.
Yeah.
Okay. Who were those ancient people? They presumably, we've got this story that modern humans were a small population 200,000 years ago, and now we're thinking a little older than that, maybe, but 300, 200,000 years ago, and that population ultimately expanded and spread throughout the world. But if in Africa they're mixing with very divergent populations, populations as different as Neanderthals, maybe more different, who were they? Where did they live? We don't know. The fossil record in this critical time span, the middle Pleistocene, 800,000 to 150,000 years ago, give or take, that time span has such a sparse fossil record. And the fossils we have at the later end of it, they share many features that living people have. We've called them anatomically modern humans, but we don't know if they're genetically connected closely to our ancestral population, or if they could be quite genetically divergent. These things are all up in the air. there could be 3-4 lineages of archaic human-like things in Africa.
Yeah.
Certainly, the ecology of Africa is varied enough compared to what we see in Eurasia, where you have, large spans of Eurasia that are ecologically homogeneous, and we've got at least now 2 versions of archaic humans there.
Yeah.
In Africa, we could easily have more, and we don't know who they are, where they lived, what their ancestry was. We don't know if Naledi could be one of them. This is all completely unknown. And for me, it's exciting, of course. But again, it's a case where today I would not predict that we've come to the end of this.
Yeah. So what's your?
I think we're just at the beginning.
Let's say let's go up to 2020. So it's like 2 years ish now, a little more than 2 years, 2.5 years. Do you think we will have ancient DNA from an archaic in Africa by then? I'm thinking maybe Ethiopia or somewhere where it's dry. What is your expectation?
I'm fairly confident that we'll have DNA from specimens here in southern Africa that have been described as early modern humans. I know that some of that work is in the works. I don't know what those results, are going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
They have to go through all kinds of quality checks and everything, and it may be the same case as we have in some of the earlier, historically earlier, 10 years ago discoveries in other parts of the world. It's not going to be great data.
Yeah.
But I think we will see that in the next few years.
Now, what about ancient DNA from Naledi?
Ancient DNA from Naledi, I can tell you, we have tried now 3 different labs, the best labs in the world. We do not have positive results from any Naledi samples, but we are going to continue to try. I think that this has a better chance of really getting a very divergent gene sequence than any other discovery we've had because of its date, because it is in that time range when you think maybe there's ancient DNA preserved.
Well,
the preservation of these bones is extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, they're like Neanderthal bones in the way that they're preserved.
You have a lot of them.
And we have a lot of them, but they are in a warm cave relative to anything in Europe. Denisova cave, you walk in and it's like a beer refrigerator. I mean, it is cold in that cave.
Nice.
And it's cold year round. Here, this is like 15 degrees Celsius year round, and it's wet. The sediments are sort of saturated, I would describe them. It's not like pools of water or anything like that, but it is, the humidity has soaked into these sediments. So I don't know. It's not great conditions. I do think we have a substantial chance of getting proteomics out of them.
Yeah.
And that may actually be the first kind of data that we get from this. I think we are on the edge of some really interesting proteomic discoveries worldwide. And I think that we will be in that game.
That's good. That's good.
You wanted to ask about the hobbits.
Yeah. Let's do time machine. John, when you first came onto my consciousness prominently, we share mutual friends, so
yeah.
I did know about you before, but it was having to with Homo, the Hobbit. In Flores, and you looked at the remains at the time, and you had said then that they were pathological. I keep track of the Hobbit stuff, but it's just really hard to know what to think. Where are we right now within the paleontological community, the community that can actually look at the fossils? Because I have no intuition on that.
What has happened over the course of the years in a political sense is initially, there were these real fights between the excavators who had, let me give credit too, right? The excavators who found these things are Indonesian investigators who are accomplished archaeologists. Mike Morwood was working with them, collaborating with them, and published the initial description of these remains. And this group had, within the Indonesian establishment, there were other paleoanthropologists. Teoku Jakob was one of them, who were skeptical of those findings, who demanded access to and took the fossils. who studied them, who put out a different interpretation of them. And that was the initial sort of fight about the Homo floresiensis. I looked at this data during those days, and I found the data as it was described to be rather unconvincing. There were questions that I wanted to have answered that were not obvious. They were not coming forward with, tell me why this is not a pathological specimen. Tell me, because some aspects of it honestly look like you see with ancient pathologies, especially ancient pathologies that in pre-modern populations, and modern here I mean like 19th, 20th century medicine populations, right?
Yeah.
You have all kinds of conditions that run their course in skeletal remains that you'd never see today, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes very difficult to assess whether you're looking at the morphology of something or not. Over the years, additional remains were published, the remains of additional individuals, none of them including the critical cranial parts, the brain especially, that the first skeleton made evident was a super big story, this very small-brained creature. There is no second brain. But there are a lot of very small remains from throughout the skeleton, many smaller than the initial skeleton, and mandibular remains that are also sort of very much like the first mandible in many respects. In addition, now, a couple of years ago, I want to say 3 years ago, a specimen from around 800,000 years ago from another Flores site was published. It's also a very, very small, tiny mandible. It looks like this has some duration. Now, I don't think we understand what's going on with this Flores population, but I think there was a population.
Yeah.
It was a population that was different from hominins that existed elsewhere in Asia. It was not Homo erectus. It was something that was different. I think we're a long ways from understanding the evolutionary history of that population. I think we need a lot more data. And of course, there are people now who are really excellent investigators. Some of them, our collaborators on the Homo naledi project, are now key investigators in the Flores project. And I think that we're going to get some very close comparisons between these two hominin populations. They pose some similar issues, two very small-brained hominins that appear to have lived very late in our evolutionary history. But they're also very different in many ways. And I think that understanding that is going to advance a lot of our ability to talk about the diverse, I want to say the possible in our evolution, the trajectories that a hominin-like form could follow. We're one of them, but there were others, and those others were here recently.
Yeah.
And by understanding that, I think we're going to understand a lot about where we came from.
Yeah. And I think, to reiterate what you had earlier said, I think one key problem is we're very teleological. We think that there's some sort of endpoint. And, who knows what that is? I mean, we were a relatively diverse, group of species or subspecies, however you define them. And to some extent, we still are a very diverse population in any case. So, I mean, this sort of teleological thinking really, I think, has confused us recently. And it's really great to be in a time when there's so much data. Now, that does lead to a lot of hypothesis generation and all these theories. And, the Daily Telegraph loves it. I mean, this is like the greatest time for British newspapers and their sensationalizing of science, right? I ignore it, but you know what I'm talking about.
We have. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration. I'm gonna pull Atapuerca into this too, right? An early, what we now understand from genetics, to be an early connection of a Neanderthal population, 450,000 years old, in Spain.
Yeah.
And it's morphologically the largest sample. It's at least 28 individuals in that site, lots and lots of skeletal remains, 6,000 now, more, I think many more than that, fossils. We here at Rising Star, we've passed 2,000 fossils from the Dinaledi-Lassetti chambers. We have, I don't think it's an exaggeration, because there are other sites as well, other discoveries that are very important, Denice. If I go back 15 years, 20 years, Atapuerca is maybe halfway through its run at that time. So maybe go back a bit further. We have more than doubled the fossil record.
Yeah.
And genetics has all come online in that time.
Yeah.
I love this comparison, because you go to Germany, outside of Dusseldorf, there's this little whistle stop called Neanderthal. which is just outside of Metmon, this little town. And there's a museum there, and you can walk to the site where they found the original Neanderthal. And the cave is gone because it was part of a quarry, and it's all gone now. But there's a marker there. And this marker is a little concrete marker, and it's got the first 300 base pairs of the mitochondrial sequence that they got from that specimen in 1997. If you take any of these genomes today, the Denice of a genome, right? That concrete marker would have to be 11 kilometers wide to hold the data. You know, just the magnification of these data sets is so enormous. And it is everything we can do to keep up with it. And these discoveries are accelerating. They're not slowing down. And we are at a phase where I don't have to argue about what people thought 50 years ago anymore. I can say, hey, we solved that problem.
You know what?
But we've got new ones.
This accelerating rate of discoveries and the fossil singularity. You're starting to sound like Ray Kurzweil. You're like the Ray Kurzweil of paleoanthropology. How many supplements do you take, John? I mean, you are out in the field. I mean, it's kind of it's pretty funny, but I mean, you're talking like, you know, paleoanthropology, like, you know, we might enter a big data phase in the 2020s if the rate of discovery keeps increasing. I know that, you know, we don't have that many hominin fossils, right? We don't have that many. Like, they could all fit into, you know, a couple of rooms or something. Is what the stylized fact was. Are we past that? Will we be past that?
You know, I've been doing a little quantifying on this because it's one of these big stories, you know, and it's a frustrating one because my colleagues tell this story. They love it, right? It's all the important fossils from this time period could fit in a shoebox. Right?
It's like Santa's bag.
And there were more paleontologists than there were well-described finds. And, all of this.
One of them says, all these fossils could fit in a shoebox and still have room for a pair of shoes. It's and there is some truth to that, right? You find something new, and it's often a fragment. It's often very small, and yet it is data that can test a hypothesis. I don't know when we'll find another rising star cave system, you know, that has this full of fossils, another Atapuerca. I do know that there are tremendous areas of this similar geology across this continent that have not been explored. And we are sitting in the most explored area. You know, I'm less than 5 kilometers from about a half dozen hominin fossil sites. You know, it's not like this is the, you know, unexplored terrain. It was looking in a new way that caused this discovery. And I really do believe that as we scale up, as our teams and others are moving throughout the continent and going into these systems, we will find other cases. We'll find the Miocene version of this with skeletons of some primitive pre-hominin ancestor. We will find the, you know, lower Pleistocene version of this. We will find the Australopithecine version of this. I really sort of believe we're going to find these things. And we are now doing science on rising star that you cannot do on any other hominin sample other than Neanderthals. And we found this site 4 years ago. And it's going to advance what we're doing with development, what we're doing with taphonomy, how this site accumulated. We're diving into it with science that's never been done before. And I think that that's going to be generally true. I think that we're moving this field into a phase. It used to be like the librarians that had the rare manuscripts, you know? And there's a component of that to it because we are dealing with World Heritage objects that have real scientific value, but also heritage value. But we are moving into a phase where we're now able to test with real statistics. And we're playing with things that nobody's thought of before. So I think now is the time. Now is the time to enter this field.
Incredible time to be a scientist. Well, listen, I think we're going to end it there, John. Thank you so much for taking time away from the excavation to talk to us. And we really look forward to hearing what you guys find out there.
Absolutely. Really pleased to do it. Thanks, guys.
All right. Talk to you later, John.
Lots of cool science going on. And in fact, there are already a couple of new traits that we want to add to the Neanderthal.
Science is moving faster than engineering for once.
Yeah, it's a cool time. And we'll go ahead and end there, but I just want to end on this concept of, we're the only species of our type left in the world today. But at one point in the past, at multiple points, in fact, there were lots of things like us out there. It was a really complicated world.
Yeah.
And, today is very unusual in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. We're in a special time. I don't know if we should feel special, but,
Yeah.
It's cool.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks. For more information about Incitome, our podcasts, and our genetic products, check out our website at incito.me. That's INSITO.me.